Hello students, and welcome back to Political Science 1513, American Federal Government. As always, I am your instructor, Connor Alford, and in this video we are going to continue with part 2 of our two-part series on the executive branch by talking about the bureaucracy, its function, purpose, structure, and the controversies that surround it. Towards this end, we have 3 learning objectives for you to focus on. Number 1 asks for you to explain what the bureaucracy is and how it has changed over time. Number 2 asks for you to identify the 3 major functions of the bureaucracy today. And then finally, the 3rd learning objective asks for you to discuss the major controversies surrounding the modern bureaucracy and its implications for the core principles of the United States Constitution. So to start with, let's begin by reviewing our overview of the executive branch as a whole. Remember that the executive branch is that organ of federal government constitutionally vested with the power and duty of executing and enforcing, or in other words, administrating the law, and that the executive branch can be further subdivided into 2 major components. The presidency, which is made up of the president and the vice president, as well as 2 groups of staffers and 2 groups of advisors, and then the executive bureaucracy, which is divided into the 15 cabinet departments, or departments of state. A cabinet department is one of the 15 major departments of the executive bureaucracy that report directly to the president and encompass a large number of subsidiary agencies. So another way of thinking about this is to understand that a bureaucracy is very simply an organization that is structured hierarchically to carry out specific functions. It is a complex structure of offices, tasks, rules, and principles of organization employed by large-scale institutions to coordinate the work of their personnel and achieve their core functions. So a bureaucracy is a hierarchical structure of unique offices or jobs that all work together towards one central task, and the cabinet department in our executive bureaucracy is the largest organizational subdivision of this bureaucracy. Let me try to explain the concept of a bureaucracy with a comparison that might be more familiar to you. The university that you currently attend as a student here at Southeastern is in fact a bureaucratic institution. We have a central function to educate our students. And that central function involves a whole bunch of subsidiary tasks. Some of us need to teach students about math, some of us need to teach them about science, and others about their social studies like political science, history, so on and so forth. So we're not going to expect any one individual to provide your instruction in all of these subjects. That's a very, very broad number of areas for one person to try to handle all by his or herself. So instead, we divide our university into separate departments, and each of these departments is going to hire its own set of professors. Each of these professors is then going to specialize in a particular part of your education. I'm teaching American government, but my colleague might teach public administration. She knows how to teach public administration. I know how to teach American government. We're both doing our job so that you can get your education and Southeastern can therefore fulfill its broader mission. But it's not just that you need different professors to teach different subjects. Those professors need somebody that they can answer to keep them coordinated. So each department has a department head, and each professor is answerable to the department head, who is then answerable to the administration that reports all the way up to the president of the university, and the president of the university coordinates efforts across all the different offices. And we're still not done, because it's not just the professors and department heads who are reporting through administration. It's not just teaching that goes into your education. There are subsidiary services. For instance, in accessing this online lecture, you might experience technical difficulties. In that case, you might need somebody to help you troubleshoot, and I'll be honest, I'm not the best person for that because I think computers are secretly magic. So you're not going to call me. You might call the university help desk, or more likely, if it's a Blackboard problem, you're going to contact CIDT. And if you are a student who actually lives on campus and you just wanted an online class, well, you might have problems with your dormitory, and therefore you're going to contact the housing department. You might need help from maintenance. You might need help from a janitor. You might need help from any number of ancillary services that I cannot provide. And so instead of expecting me, Connor Alford, your professor, to not only teach you everything you need to know, but to handle any other problems that might emerge during your education, we have taken our organization with its central mission. We've broken that mission down into a whole bunch of different jobs. We've appointed specific individuals based on their particular qualifications to each of these different jobs. We've organized the jobs into departments and into different offices that all work together in a hierarchical structure reporting up to the president. So that's what a bureaucracy looks like, and it's the same thing with our executive bureaucracy. The only difference is that instead of trying to educate Southeastern students, the executive bureaucracy of our country is trying to administrate the law of the entire United States, which is a much, much bigger and therefore a much more complicated process. I will also just briefly note that while the executive bureaucracy of the United States is the largest bureaucracy in the world, it's not the only bureaucracy. Corporations, churches, private organizations, other countries, all large-scale institutions necessarily require some kind of an organizational structure or hierarchy, and therefore all employ some form of bureaucracy. Our bureaucracy, as I've told you, is first a part of the executive branch, and then subdivided into 15 major departments. Now, each of these cabinet departments, as I've already mentioned, handles a very, very broad issue area. For instance, the Department of Homeland Security is going to be responsible for maintaining the safety of American citizens. And so what we're going to find is that it has a lot of smaller tasks that it needs to handle, and therefore the Department of Homeland Security can be subdivided into a whole host of subsidiary agencies. Subsidiary agencies are smaller and more specialized portions of the bureaucracy that are located, that are couched within, and that answer to their encompassing cabinet departments. So within the Department of Homeland Security, for instance, we have the TSA, or Transportation Security Administration. And these are the people that feel you up when you're trying to board a plane so that they can make sure that you're not hiding an explosive or a weapon under your shirt and planning to hijack a plane. But it's not just transportation that goes into Homeland Security. We've also got to deal with cybersecurity. So there is a subsidiary agency dedicated specifically to cybersecurity and infrastructure security, and this is the CSIS. We've got the Department of Justice that handles law and order. Well, within the Department of Justice, one element of administrating law and order in our country, of handling justice in our country, is investigating crimes. So we've got the FBI, or Federal Bureau of Investigation. Another element of the justice system is actually housing prisoners who have been convicted of those crimes after investigation. So in addition to the FBI, the Department of Justice also includes the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The Department of Treasury handles all things money, and within it we have the Internal Revenue Service, the U.S. Mint, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, the Network of Financial Crimes Enforcement, or FINCEN. The bottom line here is that because each of these cabinet departments handles such a very broad issue area, each of them are going to have tens of thousands of employees organized into a whole host of subsidiary agencies. And we're still not done. Because in addition to the cabinet departments and their subsidiary agencies, we also have a number of institutions within the bureaucracy that fall under a third category, independent agencies. There are two types of independent agency that we can talk about. There is the Independent Executive Agency, which is a federal agency that is not a part of any cabinet department, but that reports directly to the president and handles a relatively small issue area. An executive agency of the independent variety is going to be of about the same size as a subsidiary agency, and like a subsidiary agency, it's going to handle a relatively specialized issue area. But it's not going to report to a cabinet department, it's going to report directly to the president. So, for instance, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, is an independent executive agency. And that means that it talks directly to the president rather than going to the president through a series of reports filed into a department all the way up to the secretary of that department and then reported to the president during the next cabinet meeting. In addition to the independent executive agencies, we have independent regulatory agencies. An independent regulatory agency is a federal agency that is not a part of any cabinet department and that does not report to the president or to any cabinet department, but that is charged with making and implementing regulations within a very specific area of public interest, completely independent from any oversight or outside authority. An example of this is the FCC, or Federal Communications Commission, which is the independent regulatory agency responsible for making sure that nobody is broadcasting pornography on the Disney Channel and that radio stations aren't drowning out one another's signals. The Federal Communication Commission, by the way, is very powerful because it controls basically all things broadcast technology, and that means that it has the power to do things which many people would characterize as the censorship of free speech. But it doesn't have to justify this to really anyone because it doesn't answer to anyone. It's been given almost complete independence and it's been allowed to handle its issue area more or less however it likes. And that's very controversial, but there are some reasons why the independent regulatory agencies are left independent and don't answer to any of our elected officials. Because they tend to handle very technologically complicated and specialized issues like broadcast technology, and therefore they're dealing with topics that most of our political leaders, whose only qualifications are having won popularity contests, don't feel adequately competent to handle. And so they have given the FCC and other commissions that qualify as independent regulatory agencies a great deal of leeway to sort of keep the politics out of technically challenging issues that are hard for the public to understand. If it is helpful to you, I have prepared some visual aids and some elaboration to make further sense of this content. Big picture, the executive bureaucracy is the administrative machinery of government. It is the body of several million federal employees, including experts, paper pushers, and foot soldiers who handle the day-to-day administration of government. It is divided. These millions of employees are organized into 15 cabinet departments, each of which is headed by an appointee selected by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Each of the cabinet departments encompasses subsidiary agencies, and each of them handles a very broad issue area. But then you have the independent executive and regulatory agencies, which handle very small issue areas, just like subsidiary agencies, but don't find themselves couched within a cabinet department. The 15 cabinet departments are displayed on your slide here, and you can pause the video if you'd like to take a moment, but this information is also available to you in your book. Notice that each of these titles indicates an issue area that is very, very broad. The Department of Defense handles basically all things defense. There's a lot that goes into that. The Department of Agriculture handles all things agriculture. Food stamps relate to agriculture and fall within this category. So it makes sense then to understand that in order for these different departments to operate, they must employ their own internal hierarchy of organized offices, tasks, and subtasks assigned to particular individuals. So to provide an example of that, I've taken this diagram and modified it very slightly for your convenience from the website of the United States Department of Treasury. This shows you how the United States Department of Treasury is organized. At the top, what we're going to find is that we have the Secretary of Treasury, who works with the Inspector General, the Treasury Inspector, and other individuals, and then has a Deputy Secretary who they are going to work with in order to administrate basically the entire rest of the whole department, which is then broken down into the Office of the Treasurer, the Offices of Domestic Finance, so on and so forth, all the way on down to the smallest subsidiary agencies like the Internal Revenue Service, which is couched within the Office of Tax Policy, which answers directly to the Deputy Secretary of Treasury, who answers to the Secretary of the Treasury. And then if you want to see what the independent regulatory and executive agencies look at, I've taken this slide directly from your textbook and you can find it there, but where you see the red circle, we have the independent agencies that are managing various elements of U.S. policy, like the Federal Maritime Commission, without answering directly to anyone, with perhaps the exception of the president. So, the bureaucracy is really, really complicated, but it is arguably necessary. It is arguably important, because what we're going to find is that within our federal government structure, the federal bureaucracy handles three broad functions that are very important to the day-to-day administration of our country. The three major functions of the modern executive bureaucracy are as follows. Number one, the executive bureaucracy implements statutory laws. Remember from our previous lecture that a statutory law is a law created by Congress rather than, say, a constitutional law, which is created by the Constitution, or common law, which is law created by activist judges in the judicial branch. Well, what we're going to discover is that the first and most fundamental function of the executive bureaucracy as a part of the executive branch is to administrate and enforce the laws that the legislative branch has created. And they're important for this process because, as I've mentioned before, Congress is relatively small. We only have 535 individuals in Congress, and we have well over 100 million people living in this country right now. So consequently, what we're going to discover is that in order for any of the laws that Congress creates pursuant to its constitutional authority depends upon the executive bureaucracy for implementation. If Congress creates a new tax, for instance, that doesn't mean that Mark Wayne Mullen is going to show up on the doorsteps or at the banks of every individual within Congressman Mullen's district. Instead, there are bureaucrats who are going to make sure that the money is actually being paid and that it's going where it's supposed to go. Understand that the executive bureaucracy is able to do this in part because it has the manpower. The executive bureaucracy of the United States today is the largest employer in human history. Not counting military personnel, it has upwards of 2.8 million employees and growing. Its strength somewhat under the administration of Donald Trump, but it's on the upward direction, once again, under the current administration. And if you count military employees, that number is going to jump to about 4 million. And that's still not everyone, because it's ignoring the some 3 million plus civilian contractors who work for the federal government in some way, shape, or form, but who aren't technically federal employees. So they have manpower, and that manpower is useful because it means that they can actually put boots on the ground and actually go out and check the roads to make sure they're in good condition, and send construction teams in to repair them when they're not, or send individuals to inspect the classrooms of American schools to identify prevailing issues in different regions of the country, so on and so forth. Manpower is an important part of why the executive bureaucracy is arguably necessary. But in addition to this, we've got expertise within the executive bureaucracy that doesn't necessarily exist in Congress. Because remember, to get into Congress or to become the president, you got to win a popularity contest. You have to win an election. You don't necessarily have to have any real-world skills or knowledge or expertise or qualifications. You just have to be very good at getting people to like you. Whereas in the bureaucracy, individuals are not elected, they are hired. And at least in theory, they are hired according to a system of meritocracy, where the executive agencies that are looking to bring on new employees publicly announce the opening. Individuals send in applications. And then reviewers go through those applications and select the most qualified individuals for interviews. If those individuals are able to perform well in their interviews, demonstrating competence and expertise, and their resume demonstrates proper qualifications, they get the job. The most qualified person with the most appropriate experience, knowledge, and skill sets gets the job. And what that means is that these people are arguably more qualified to do things like interpret the laws that Congress has written. Very frequently, Congress signs off on laws that many members of Congress can't make sense of because they're dealing with very complicated things like healthcare or infrastructure, and you don't really have a lot of doctors or engineers in the United States Senate. So they're going to provide us with the expertise we need to understand and implement, as well as the manpower we need to administrate statutory laws on the ground level. In addition to this traditional function of implementing statutory law, over the years, the executive bureaucracy has begun to make and enforce what we call administrative laws. If a statutory law is a law created by Congress, then an administrative law is a law or regulation created by one of the agencies or departments within the executive bureaucracy. In other words, administrative laws are created not by elected officials in the legislative branch, but by unelected bureaucrats in the executive branch. And at this point, there should probably be some alarm bells going off in the back of your head. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I want you to understand that there are reasons why we have individuals in the executive branch who are not elected, who you could not name or recognize, but who are making laws that you have to follow. And this has to do with what we call delegated authority. To delegate is to give over or charge with. And what we're going to discover is that the various lawmaking agencies, the various regulatory institutions in our executive bureaucracy, receive their lawmaking authority from Congress. So, for instance, the Environmental Protection Agency has been authorized by Congress to create administrative laws. But I want you to understand that the administrative lawmaking authority of the EPA and other agencies in the executive bureaucracy tends to be quite narrow. The EPA has been authorized to exercise lawmaking authority within the realm of environmental policies and regulations, but it has not been authorized by Congress to create regulations for internet communication. And if it were to try and begin making rules in those areas, at least theoretically, there would be some pushback because it hasn't been authorized by Congress to do so. So where do bureaucracies and bureaucratic agencies get their authority to create administrative laws? Through acts of Congress delegating some portion of Congress's lawmaking authority to those bureaucratic agencies. And again, this usually happens when Congress finds itself dealing with an issue that it doesn't feel competent to address. In the case of the EPA, we basically had rivers catching on fire, and Congress didn't know what to do about it because turns out doing things like regulating pollution and keeping our rivers healthy is very, very technical, challenging, and difficult, and most people in Congress just didn't know what they needed to know to demonstrate the necessary expertise to handle that situation. So they created the EPA and asked the EPA to take care of it on Congress's behalf. Finally, the third major function of the modern executive bureaucracy is to engage in administrative adjudication, which is to act as a judge in disputes involving administrative laws. In other words, to interpret and apply administrative laws to particular cases when they come into dispute or controversy. And once again, what we're going to discover is that this is a bit peculiar because the executive branch, including the executive bureaucracy, is not the judicial branch. It is not constitutionally authorized to engage in administrative adjudication. However, remember from your reading of Article 3 of the Constitution last week that the United States Constitution authorizes Congress to create such courts under the Supreme Court as it shall from time to time deem necessary. And what we're going to discover is that there is nothing in the Constitution which explicitly says that Congress cannot create these courts in the form of an administrative tribunal and then locate that tribunal within a bureaucratic agency over in the executive branch. So this is perhaps less explicitly unconstitutional, but it might still be concerning. Because when Congress authorizes the administrative bureaucracy, which is already administrating the law, to not only create laws and to adjudicate laws, it is violating some really important constitutional principles. Right? Remember from prior lecture, and here's where we're starting to talk about the controversy of the executive bureaucracy. Remember from prior lecture that one of the first of the 7 core principles of constitutional government in our country is the principle of separated powers, which says that these 3 cardinal functions, administrating, adjudicating, and legislating, should never be concentrated into any one branch of government. And yet today, that's exactly what's happening within the administrative bureaucracy. The executive bureaucracy adjudicates the law, the administrative bureaucracy creates the law, and it also administrates or executes and enforces the law. And remember from prior lecture that if you don't have separation of powers, you can't have the second major constitutional principle on this slide, checks and balances. Checks and balances is the constitutional principle that in dividing the 3 core functions of government across different branches, you must give each branch some way to check the other branches so that it can protect its own authority and keep those other branches from getting too powerful. For instance, if the president were to sign an executive order that you felt violated your constitutional rights, you might feel that the president has overstepped his rightful bounds. And you can challenge that executive order by taking the president to court. And that dispute between you and the president, where you say the president violated the Constitution, the president says, no, I didn't, will be mediated and resolved by a neutral third party, the independent judicial branch. If you had to take your dispute directly to the president, you would lose, because the president is not going to declare his own actions unconstitutional. If he thought that what he had done was unconstitutional, he probably wouldn't have done it. And if he were willing to do it anyway, then he's probably not going to have a change of heart. He will be biased in his own favor. So we need to check the president or Congress or other actors in government by having an independent judicial branch that can review disputes about the executive orders of the president or the laws of Congress. But that's not how things work when we're talking about administrative laws, right? Because remember, administrative laws are created by the executive bureaucracy, and they're adjudicated by the executive bureaucracy. So if the Environmental Protection Agency creates a new law or regulation that you feel has violated your rights, and you want them to review that, you don't go to the judicial branch, generally speaking, you go to the EPA. And the EPA will tell you whether your rights have been violated or not. And because the EPA is going to be biased in its own favor, you're going to lose. There are effectively no checks or balances that limit abuses of executive bureaucratic authority built into the system. And consequently, what we're going to find is that the executive bureaucracy is far and away not only the largest, but the most active portion of our federal government. And this is a pretty good segue into our next major topic. The executive bureaucracy today is also controversial because it violates a third major constitutional principle, that of limited government. Remember, the principle of limited government tells us that the government should be limited in size, scope, power, and activity. And by and large, the main way that we limit power is through checks and balances, which don't apply to the executive bureaucracy, so the executive bureaucracy essentially has unchecked and unlimited power. It's also not limited in size. The executive bureaucracy, it is worth noting, has been around for at least as long as our Constitution. But it's become a totally new creature, unlike anything the framers could have or would have thought desirable. Under the first presidential administration, the executive bureaucracy had about 50 employees across 3 separate departments. Today, again, it's getting closer to 3 million. The number on the slide says 2.6 million. It's actually closer to 2.8 million right now. And again, that's excluding military personnel. Count them, and they are technically a part of the executive bureaucracy. We're looking at closer to 4 million. Add in the civilian contractors and other individuals. We're getting close to 7 million, which again goes to show that this is not limited in size or scope. It is not limited government. It is massive government. It makes the executive bureaucracy the largest bureaucracy in the entire world. Our executive bureaucracy is bigger than the executive bureaucracy of any other country. Our executive bureaucracy employs more people, pays more people than Walmart and McDonald's combined. And that is not limited government. We can try to spin it, we can argue that it's necessary, but it is still incompatible with the constitutional principle of limited government, not only in terms of its unchecked power, but in terms of its overall size. Limited government should also be limited in its overall degree of activity, and yet that's not what we are actually observing. Remember from our lecture on the legislative branch that in order to create new policies, Congress has to go through a very convoluted system that is extremely difficult. And that the framers intended for this process to be extremely difficult because they wanted to keep Congress from creating too many laws. They wanted to limit its overall activity so that they could preserve individual freedom. But today what we're going to find is that people in the United States live under the largest body of laws in the history of human existence. And very few of those laws are actually going to come from Congress. So, for instance, in 2020, for every 178 laws, for the 178 new laws created by Congress, the bureaucracy created 3,353 new laws. Congress created 178 laws, but the bureaucracy, which doesn't have to go through that same complicated legislative process, created 3,353 new laws. And it's worth noting that the laws created by the bureaucracy tend to be much longer and more complicated and more cumbersome than those signed into law by Congress. So another way to understand exactly how active, how many new rules and regulations the bureaucracy is creating every year, if you look at those 3,353 new laws created by the executive bureaucracy in 2020, you're going to discover that they amount to 95,894 new pages of laws for that year alone. And that's a lot of new rules and regulations telling you what you can and cannot do, how you can and cannot behave, what you must or mustn't engage in. So this isn't limited government, and it is, again, a violation of yet another important constitutional principle. But we're not done yet. In addition to violating checks and balances, separated power, and limited government, the modern bureaucracy also violates the constitutional principle of republicanism and the constitutional principle of the social contract. Because remember, the social contract theory of our Constitution tells us that the government gets its authority to make rules governing our day-to-day life from the consent of the governed. Well, in a Republican government system, such as ours, how does one go about expressing or withdrawing consent to be governed by a particular administration? By voting in elections. If you don't like the current president, you'll have an opportunity to vote that president out of office. And this means that presidents are accountable to the people. If you don't like your representative in Congress, you can fire that representative by getting together with your friends and voting against that representative. And this means that representatives, if they want to keep their job, and they do want to keep their job, have a reason to care what you want and to be responsive to the wants, needs, interests, and expectations of the people. This is not true of the executive bureaucracy. Because remember, bureaucrats are not elected, they're hired. So bureaucracy in our country is fundamentally undemocratic and thoroughly incompatible with the constitutional principle of republicanism. Even if they were elected, the bureaucracy is so large that it's impossible to figure out which particular decision makers are responsible for which policies. So you're unable to reward the bureaucratic decision makers who create good rules and regulations and punish the ones that create exploitative, oppressive, bad, or incompetent or corrupt rules and regulations. So the bureaucracy is thoroughly unelected and unaccountable. It is not going to be a democratic portion of the government, which is inconsistent with the social contract. Because remember that it is the portion of our federal government that creates the vast majority of the new laws we live under. 3,353 new laws by the bureaucracy compared to 178 by Congress. That's startling. It means that our country's status as a democracy or a republic is becoming increasingly questionable, because an increasingly smaller number or proportion of our country's legal codes and new rules or regulations are being made by elected officials, and an increasingly large portion of our country's administrative decisions or legislative policies are being made by unelected bureaucrats that none of us know, that none of us have any control over. And we're still not done. The most common complaint that you hear people articulate against the executive bureaucracy is that it's expensive. And it is, because remember, we're looking at about 7 million people if you're counting military personnel and if you're counting the civilian contractors. But even if you exclude them, we're looking at 2.7, 2.8 million individuals across the current executive bureaucracy, all of whom have to be paid. And it's not just their paychecks. They receive benefits. Federal employees receive very, very generous benefit packages compared to their counterparts in the private marketplace. And it's not just that the employees have to be paid and have to receive benefits like health care and health coverage. Agencies are going to need resources like the money and revenue they need to provide very simple supplies like printers and ink to keep their heating and air on, to keep their lights going, to pay for projects, vehicles, gasoline, so on and so forth. And programs that are being carried out by these various agencies are also going to have certain monetary requirements that are going to cost money. And this money doesn't just magically appear. It comes from you, the American taxpayer. And so what we're going to discover is that today, the tax burden of American citizens is far and away higher than anything our country has ever seen before. If you were to look at the United States economy with a bird's eye view, and you were to calculate the value of every single good or service marketed by any individual in the entire country, and you were to add up the value of each and every single item bought or sold, each and every good or service bought or sold, for every single organization, company, business, or individual in the entire nation, every day, for every week, for every month, for an entire year, you would come to a value called the GDP, or Gross Domestic Product, of the United States. And by the way, our GDP is the largest in human history. But for every $100 worth of goods and values produced by every individual in the entire American economy, 36 of those are being consumed by the government and dispatched to bureaucrats in the executive branch. And what that means is that more than a third, nearly 4/10 of all the wealth in our entire country is being controlled by one portion of the federal government, is being consumed not by the general public, but by the bureaucracy. However, it is also worth noting two things. Number one, while the tax burden of American citizens today is substantially higher than anything the framers could have expected or would have thought desirable, it's still relatively low compared to citizens in some other countries. And it is also important to understand that, contrary to popular misconception, the revenue being used by the bureaucracy and by our federal government does not primarily go to military expenditures. And so what we're going to find is that about 60% of all the money spent by our federal government, pretty much entirely through the executive bureaucracy, goes to what sometimes get called entitlement programs to help the poor and the elderly. The idea behind these entitlement programs is that individuals are entitled to live a certain quality of life, and we need to use public resources to ensure that. So if you look at the pie chart I've replicated from your textbook, you're going to find that about 40% of all federal spending goes to Social Security to help the elderly, and then an additional 23% to Medicare, and an additional 15% to Medicaid. Altogether, what we're going to find is that these programs to help the poor and elderly are going to make up about 68% of the spending in our country. Add on top of that an additional 16% for income security, and an additional 4% for veterans benefits. And what you're going to find is that when we're looking at mandatory expenditures in our country, they're not going to the military, or at least not predominantly. And even if you move away from the mandatory expenditures, which are basically new expenditures that Congress is mandated by past policies to authorize that automatically go into effect, and you look at the total budget, you're still going to find that about 60% of all government spending goes not to creating bombs and aircraft carriers, but helping people who are poor and needy, going to programs like SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program that most of us call food stamps. Military and defense spending, on the other hand, is set to about 15%. And by the way, that number itself is still a little bit misleading, because you hear military defense and you think that all of this is going to building bombs, guns, and aircraft carriers, but that's not true. The majority of the money we spend in military defense goes to providing benefits, coverage, and packages to the active duty servicemen and women and their family or dependents. If any of you have grown up in a military household, you know that the military families in our country receive very, very generous benefits packages covering health care, dental, psychological services, so on and so forth, that most other countries don't provide to their soldiers. So most other countries don't spend their military defense budgets in the same way that we spend. The bottom line then is that, yeah, the bureaucracy today is extremely expensive. Yes, it violates the social contract theory of our Constitution. No, it's not consistent with the theory of limited government, checks and balances, or separated powers. But it does provide some critically important services that many people argue are necessary for the good functioning of our government on a day-to-day basis, including the implementation of statutory law, the administration and enforcement of administrative laws, and the adjudication of disputes about administrative laws. And while it is true to say that it is very expensive, that money might be going to causes that you consider worthy. Perhaps we are willing to spend a larger portion of our own money to help make sure nobody is dying alone in horrible poverty and that children aren't going hungry in the streets. The bottom line here is I'm not telling you that you need to like or that you should hate the executive bureaucracy. I just want you to understand that it is controversial, because it's clearly not consistent with the United States Constitution, and it's very hard to argue otherwise. But it is arguably very necessary.